Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Peter Singer from Princeton University. Peter needs no introduction. He's one of the world's best-known moral philosophers and the author of several books on moral philosophy and the recipient of many prestigious awards. There's also a Peter Singer Award named in his honor. Much of Peter's thinking is about the consideration we give to others. He calls for, quote-unquote, equal consideration for animals. His first book on animals, called Animal Liberation, was published in 1975 and was updated recently with the title Animal Liberation Now. Peter's had a big impact on my life. I stopped eating meat after reading his book because I just couldn't support an industry that imposes suffering at the scale that he describes. It was that simple for me. I suspect many of you might make the same decision if you read his book. And to be honest, I feel a lot better physically on a largely plant-based diet. Peter, you've changed my life. Welcome to Brave New World. Truly an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's good to get to meet you and talk to you.
Indeed, good to see you in person. So, Peter, you're someone who really needs no introduction. So let's just start with, I was reading about your life and how your parents immigrated from Vienna to Australia, and some of the sort of defining moments early in your life. You refer to having a meal with your fellow graduate student, Richard Cashin, and, how that sort of had an impact on you. What have been the pivotal moments in your career that really sort of set you in a certain direction?
Well, that lunch was certainly one of them. That set me in the direction of thinking about animals as beings with a moral status that means we shouldn't treat them as we do treat them, and as I had been complicit in treating them because I'd eaten meat up to that point. I was 24 years old, and I'd never had a discussion with anyone about eating meat. That was 1970, and vegetarians were very rare, and I wouldn't have known what the word vegan even meant. Very few people would have. So, yes, that changed me in regard to everything that I've done with regard to animals since. But I think it also connected me more with making the work that I was doing in ethics, because I was a graduate student working in ethics. And that made me think about ways in which my work in ethics was connected to my life. Obviously, if an ethical decision changes the way you eat, then ethics is affecting your daily life very significantly. And I had already thought about issues relating to global poverty and what should I be doing in terms of helping people in extreme poverty. And I think the connection with ethics and what I was eating made me think again about that, and that I really ought to be doing more in that respect as well.
So what was it that Richard said that you thought was so clearly stated that it was so compelling that you hadn't heard before?
Well, basically I hadn't heard anything about the moral status of animals before, or any challenges to the idea that eating meat was a acceptable thing to do. So to meet somebody who was a vegetarian was very unusual. Now, if you have an Indian background, then clearly that's not so unusual. But I was not likely to be influenced by somebody coming from a Hindu tradition, for example. That would be a different way of thinking to mine. Whereas Richard's way of thinking was much more direct and straightforward. He said something like, I don't think it's right to treat animals the way they're being treated to be turned into food. And that led me to ask, firstly, what do you mean by how they're treated? Because I had assumed that they were leading reasonably good lives out in the fields, fairly natural circumstances, until the day they were trucked to slaughter and killed. And obviously that was bad. I knew that. But I hadn't really thought about their lives as a whole. And Richard told me that that wasn't the case for many of the animals I was eating, particularly chickens and pigs, and also veal calves, if I ate veal, which I suppose I had, that they were indoors, that they were confined in ways that didn't really pay any attention to their well-being beyond the point at which it affected their productivity. And those two things can come apart. So you can have higher economic return from animals who have very poor welfare. So it was that kind of information that had an impact on me that I'd never, but it led me to think about, well, what is it that justifies us in treating animals in ways that we would never treat humans? So it opened up that question, and I looked at some of the philosophers of the past who talked about animals, and what they said generally seemed clearly sort of special pleading to justify the way we treat animals. I mean, some of them, like Aquinas, would appeal to the dominion verse in the Bible, which was not going to carry any weight with me because I wasn't religious. And Aristotle talked about the less rational existing to serve the more rational. So he had a pre-Darwinian view of the nature of the universe. That obviously wasn't going to carry any weight either. Descartes said that animals are like automata. They're not capable of feeling pain. They just make noises like alarm clocks do, but they're more complicated because they were made by God, and alarm clocks are just made by us. That seemed a terrible argument. So I didn't find very much. And even those who were, somewhat better, I suppose, Kant says that animals are not autonomous, self-conscious beings, and therefore we don't have obligations to them. But that also didn't really get to the point about the fact that they can suffer. And, surely the suffering of animals, I thought, is going to matter, even if they are not self-conscious or autonomous. So, essentially that lunch with Richard took me into a sort of reflection on these issues and attempt to educate and inform myself. And eventually I decided that this is just another prejudice. It's to parallel with the way in which white racists had justified slavery, for example. Clearly, we see those arguments as spurious and as just trying to prop up something that was convenient for them. And I started to see the way we think about animals in the same way.
Who influenced you from the animal rights side? You mentioned Ruth Harrison, and who wrote, I think that's the name.
Ruth Harrison wrote a book describing factory farming, yes, Animal Machines.
And when did she write that book? Was that in the 60s?
Yeah, I think it must have been in the 60s, yes. I have a copy on the shelf behind you if you want me to look at it. But, I'm sure it was in the 60s because this was 1970 and it would have come out some years before that. Yeah, but she wasn't talking about the rights perspective. In fact, I'm not an animal rights advocate philosophically. I talk about animal rights as a sort of shorthand slogan, which people understand. But I'm a utilitarian, so rights isn't the foundation of my views about animals.
So, in a few words, just tell us, for those of my listeners who don't really know much about utilitarianism, what is it in a nutshell?
Utilitarianism is the view that the right thing to do is the thing that will have the best consequences. And by best consequences, utilitarians mean maximizing the surplus of happiness over misery, if there is such a surplus, or if there isn't, then minimizing the surplus of misery over happiness. So it's essentially saying the right action is the one that produces the higher well-being for all of those affected by the actions.
Now, you have this expression, I guess, equal consideration.
Equal consideration of similar interests.
Right. So just explain that, because I was sort of struck by that. And you said in your first book that I want to talk about, which was Animal Liberation. Not the first book, but the one that preceded the one that we're going to talk about now. Yeah. That's when I came across it. And you said equal consideration doesn't necessarily mean equal treatment. I don't know if I'm expressing that right. So just unpack that.
Well, it's equal consideration of interests. That's the principle, which isn't a principle that I invented. It was in use in discussions by philosophers of equality, philosophers who were trying to ask the question, what is the basis for saying all humans are equal? Because it's obviously not that they're all the same or equal in various capacities that you might name. And I thought the most plausible answer to that was the idea, well, they all have interests. Their lives can go well or badly in various ways. And we should give equal consideration, equal weight to their interests. We shouldn't say, as say racists do, that the interests of a white person are more weighty and should give more consideration than the interests of a black person. So that was the ultimate basis of equality, and that seemed a reasonable answer. But the question was, why is that limited to members of our species? And that was what I decided was wrong about these justifications for our treatment of animals, that they gave us the idea that ethics stops at the boundary of our species, and there wasn't a plausible reason why that should be so. If we're talking about equal consideration of interests, then clearly many non-human animals have interests. They have interest in not suffering, not feeling pain. They may have interest in enjoying their lives, in their lives going well for them. And so then the question is, well, what should we do about that? And as I say, we should give equal consideration to their interests. But of course, they may have different interests, and they do have different interests in many respects, as well as having some similar interests. So, for example, they don't have an interest in getting an education in the way that humans do. As I may say to my students here at Princeton, they have an interest in learning things about the world and getting educated. But cows grazing in the field have no such interest. So that's why equal treatment isn't appropriate. It would be crazy to think that we ought to, because we provide schools for our children, that we should provide schools for calves. What we ought to do is talk about equal consideration for similar interests, and a similar interest is not feeling pain, not being made to suffer. And, since I've used the example of cows, an interest that is similar to some degree anyway is a mother's interest in not being separated from her child. Because it's clear that in the dairy industry, where you annually make cows pregnant and remove their calves, both the calf and the mother suffer from that. So that should get some weight. It may not be the same kind of suffering as a human mother gets if her child is taken away from her shortly after birth. So there may be different degrees of suffering, but we shouldn't ignore the interest of a cow in having her calf with her while the calf is young.
So what was the reaction to Animal Liberation, which you published in 1975, almost 50 years ago?
So the reaction was somewhat mixed, but I was really pleased and relieved that there was a significant reaction to it, that it wasn't ignored, because it was still a very unfashionable subject at that time. There was a general assumption that issues about animals were not serious. They couldn't compare to the major political issues of the day, where that might be like racial equality in the American South or the war in Vietnam. But issues about animals were seen as not issues that serious people would discuss. you had to be an animal lover to think about that. Was the general way of thinking. And so I was pleased that there was a reaction, that the book got reviewed in a wide range of newspapers from the New York Times on, and was discussed. And some of those reviews were very good. The New York Times review, for example, was an extremely positive review. But there was also some attempts to ridicule the book from, I guess, particularly opponents of the ideas that I was putting forward. I remember I did a television program in Australia called Monday Conference, which there were several farmers in the audience who tried to denigrate the ideas of the book. So, yeah, it got mixed reactions, but it got some attention. That was the main thing.
So your current book, which is Animal Liberation Now, like 50 years later, what's changed since that time?
There's an immense amount that has changed, and particularly in the descriptive chapters of the book. So there's a long chapter on factory farming, and there's a long chapter on the use of animals in research. And I did revise the book in 1990, but I hadn't revised the body of the text since then. So if you were picking up the book in the beginning of this year, say, and you wanted to know whether the way we experiment on animals is a problem, everything that you would have read would have been from the 1980s or earlier. And so you might well have said, well, this doesn't tell me anything about what the situation is like today. And somewhat similarly with factory farming, there have been a lot of changes since then, some positive, but a lot of negative ones as well. And you wouldn't have known about that. So updating the factual parts of the book was a major part of the work involved in it. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about the animal movement, which hadn't existed when the first edition came out, and the progress that has been made, as well as the progress that still needs to be made. So I wanted to sort of take stock of where we are in that movement.
Did you also at that time get resistance to things like, how do we know animals feel anything? How do we know that they suffer? I mean, I expect that there would have been pushback against basic things like that at that time.
In 1975, you mean?
In 75, yeah. Because
Yeah.
when I was reading your Animal Liberation Now, you point to the fact that there's a lot more information we have about animals, of all kinds, octopi, lobsters. And in fact, I remember seeing this documentary, My Octopus Teacher, which is fascinating, just about the sort of sentience and intelligence and planning and feelings that octopi have. I can imagine that kind of information really didn't exist way back in the 70s.
No, certainly not about an octopus, and not that much research about fish either. There was certainly people who doubted that fish can feel pain. I think everybody who lived with a cat or dog was not going to really question whether animals can feel pain. I think they knew that. The possible exception was some of the psychology experimenters, researchers, adopted a kind of a behaviorism where they would not actually refer to animals as having mental states. They were not exactly denying that they had mental states, but they were saying it's unscientific to impute mental states to them because we can't observe that. So if we want psychology to be a science, we should only report what we observe. So they would give an animal an electric shock from a particular apparatus, and they would say the animal showed an aversive response, basically meaning it moved away or tried to move away. And they wouldn't say the animal showed signs of pain. So there was a bit of that, and that disappeared over the decade or so after the book was published. I'm not saying it happened because the book was published. I think it didn't really make for good science either. So, yeah, that changed a little, but there was somewhat more resistance to that, the idea of animals feeling pain in some circles in 75 than there was when there is now.
I've read that people sort of protest, against some of your ideas, and, times when you've been speaking, people protest. What are people sort of running up against? Are they, because you sort of take your utilitarian thinking, basically to its sort of logical conclusions, which is that sometimes taking a life might actually be doing someone a favor, might actually be a good thing. And that sort of, I guess, evokes a real visceral reaction from some groups. What are the kinds of reactions you run up against in your thinking and sort of, applying this utilitarian approach to ethics?
I think the strongest reactions have come in the area of euthanasia or assisted dying. And they took some time to develop after it, because I've been writing about that issue from the 1970s. But it was only at the end of the 1980s that the first protests against that began. And they began when I was speaking in Germany, where the very term euthanasia has Nazi associations, because the Nazis had what they described as a euthanasia program. But it was not euthanasia in the sense of being for the benefit of the people who were being essentially being killed. It was supposedly beneficial for the purity of the Aryan race. So it had nothing at all to do with what I was advocating. But I think the term itself was disturbing. And there was also at that time, this is 1989, a more militant disability movement in Germany than there was certainly in Australia, where I was then living, and I think probably more than here too. So they started protesting against my views, which they said were ableist, harmful to people with disabilities. That issue comes up occasionally. So the views that I've defended are that sometimes an infant may be born with such a dire prognosis because of very severe damage, brain damage, or a genetic condition, that the life of the child is likely to be one with a lot of suffering and little or no redeeming positive features. And I've defended voluntary euthanasia for a long time, and I think that in those situations with infants who obviously can't make a choice themselves, parents should be allowed to make that choice after fully informing themselves about the nature of the condition, and preferably talking to people who have brought up a child with that condition to see what the life of the child is like. And that's the view that has definitely provoked the most protests.
What about on the animal side, the sort of equal consideration? What's the sort of resistance you run into on that front, right? Because, as you mentioned earlier, people, have a view that humans sort of are at the top of the pyramid in terms of importance of some sort. Right? And you talk about speciesism, where, you refer to that as speciesism, where we are a more important species and therefore our preferences matter more. What sort of resistance, what's the counter from that side that no, we, clearly animals are somehow different and therefore don't deserve equal consideration?
Sometimes it's religious. Sometimes it says things like, God made us as a special creation, as described in the book of Genesis, and gave us permission to use the animals. But it can also be based on obviously true facts that we have higher cognitive capacities, that we use language in ways that are more sophisticated than any of the communications that non-human animals use, certainly if it comes to abstract ideas, if it comes to thinking about the long-term future. So people will talk about those differences, and they will argue that those differences make us more important. And I don't deny that there's a sense in which they do make us more important, because they give us much more power over all of the planet and all of the creatures on the planet. So there is a sense in which we're more important. But what I do deny is that means that for us to feel pain is somehow morally more significant than for an animal to feel a similar degree or intensity of pain to what we're feeling. I don't think that necessarily follows. There may be some pains which only we can feel because we are anticipating things that will happen that we know about, but that otherwise don't impact us at the moment. And so that might be one kind of suffering that we have that animals are not capable of. But when we compare the forms of suffering that are similar, whether they're physical or emotional, then I don't think we can assume that our suffering is always worse because of our higher cognitive capacities.
So another argument for higher consideration for humans over animals seems to be that they don't have any accomplishments.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with that. I think my argument is based on, as I said, similar interests, and I think the interests that are closely similar are ones relating to pain and suffering, and possibly sometimes to pleasure. But I think the interest in continuing to live is different, and I think it is arguable that those humans who have higher cognitive capacities than non-human animals may have different interests in continuing to live for the kind of reason that you mentioned, and not only that we have the possibility of those achievements, but that we may want those achievements, we may work for them. So we, more than any other species, I think, will do something now that we would not do, except for the fact that this will bring us something that we want in some quite distant future. And we will do that quite consciously and deliberately. And so if our life is ended after we do that, but before that future has come, then whatever we did, it might be studying for a degree, it might be work to build something that we then want to live in. Whatever we did will be rendered vain and pointless if we're killed before we enjoy the fruits of our labor. And of course, you could say, well, that can happen with animals too. Birds will construct a nest, squirrels will bury acorns. Are they doing that in the same sense, anticipating the future and looking forward to that? Maybe, but maybe also not. I think it's really hard to answer those questions. So it's reasonable to say that killing a human being with normal cognitive capacities of a human being is typically something that is more serious and typically worse if it's against the will and interest of the being than doing that to a non-human animal. But as I say, that doesn't really get to grips with the argument that I'm putting forward, which is based on suffering. And also the other thing to say is that the ethics that most humans have do not rely only on those cognitive capacities, because when we talk about humans having a right to life, we apply that to babies, and we apply that to humans with profound cognitive disabilities who don't have any kind of capacity to anticipate the future that is beyond that of non-human animals.
Peter, in your new book, The Animal Liberation Now, you talk about this meat paradox. What is it, and what does it mean?
So the meat paradox is something that psychologists talk about, which is relating to the fact that most of us want to be kind to animals. We want to think positively of ourselves with regard to how we treat animals. We don't like to think of ourselves as being cruel to animals. And yet, nevertheless, we eat them, and we do have some awareness. Nowadays, I think this is sharper than it was, as I said, when I first had that conversation with Richard Keshen in 1970. But I think a lot of people know that there is a lot of suffering in the meat industry, and so the paradox is that they would like to think of themselves as someone who's good to animals, and yet they continue to eat meat.
Why is that? Is that just because they're uninformed, or whether it's just, or is it just too painful to look under the hood?
I don't think it's because they're uninformed. If it was, it wouldn't be a paradox. It would just be ignorance. I think it's closer to what you said, that they're afraid to look under the hood. But I also think it's just part of the strength of culture and habits in putting kind of you could say almost compelling people to eat meat. But compelling is too strong. But making it more difficult for them to resist the idea that they should be eating meat. And I think a large part of that is cultural conformity. I think if you were brought up in a society in which few people ate meat, then it would be different. You might still end up eating meat after trying it. I'm not saying that's impossible, but it would be much easier to say, no, I don't want to eat meat, and move away from it. You wouldn't have the feeling that in some way you were criticizing your friends or putting yourself on a higher moral plane, perhaps being a bit self-righteous by not eating meat when they're continuing to do so.
In the last chapter of your book, I think it's the last chapter, I think it begins with something like, give me a child until they're 7. And it reminded me of this movie called 7 Up.
Oh, right. Yes, I've read that.
And then 14 Up and 20. I saw the whole series.
Yeah.
And the point there was that, we're so conditioned and shaped by the time we're 7. And you refer to this in your book, that kids grow up thinking that, animals are having this wonderful bucolic life on the farm. And so it's just misinformation and conditioning as far as children are concerned.
Well, certainly with children, we don't confront them with what they're eating and where it's come from. And all of the children's books about farms present some kind of idyllic farm in which all the animals are outside in the field, which is just completely contrary to the reality of the vast majority of farmed animals today.
And you referred to the psychologist, I guess, Lawrence Kohlberg, and his son having some problems with eating meat. Tell us a little bit about that. What was that about?
Yes, well, Lawrence Kohlberg was a famous Harvard professor of psychology who was interested in moral development and is best known for having developed a scale of moral development, of different levels of moral thinking that children go through. In the case of his own child, he relates this in a footnote in one of his books. When the child was 4, the child said, I don't want to eat meat. And it was something to do with, I love animals and I don't want to eat meat. And Kohlberg says that this is an example of the child being at a very low stage of development in his moral thought, because he'd failed to draw some important distinctions that, you would typically draw only when you got to be, 16 or something like that. And so, they persuaded the child to go back to eating meat, which seems to me very sad from both the child's point of view and the animal's point of view, and a little blind to the fact that people can develop in different ways and have different ethical insights at different times.
What kind of distinctions was he talking about?
The distinctions of moral development?
Yeah.
They're to do with at very early stages when you're egoistic, but this child wasn't being egoistic. It was something to do with recognizing the moral status of persons. I think Kohlberg, as a Harvard psychologist at the time when John Rawls was a very influential Harvard philosopher, became influenced by Rawls' account in A Theory of Justice of the idea that that we're all separate persons and we have equal status in some way, and we should decide on the rights that we have behind a curtain of ignorance that in which we have to choose. And so I think, but Rawls also is rather blind to the issue of animals in A Theory of Justice. He mentions it, somewhere towards the back of a very fat book, and says at one point, I don't quite know what the answer to this problem is. This was the question about why we treat humans. So let me go back and start again, and maybe a bit. Because he thinks that justice is something that is contractual, that you agree with others to achieve just institutions, but you do so behind this veil of ignorance, where you don't know who you're going to be in the society. So Rawls then says this explains why we don't owe justice to animals, because they can't reciprocate. They can't be parties to a contract. And then he faces the question, well, what about babies or humans with profound intellectual disability who can't reciprocate either? And he says, well, the babies, they will have the potential to reciprocate when they get older. But I can't explain exactly why the humans are included, but I'm sure that there's a solution to this problem, something really weak like that. So maybe Kohlberg was influenced by that way of thinking.
So, Peter, is capitalism sort of at odds with some of the ideas you lay out in both, practical ethics and animal liberation now? And I'm, there was an excerpt from your book. So it says, in free market conditions, it will always be difficult to rear animals for food on a large scale without inflicting considerable suffering. The factory farm is nothing more than the application of technology and market forces to the idea that animals are means to our ends.
Yeah, but it's the idea that animals are means to our ends that is fundamental.
Yeah.
Capitalism, as I say, is merely the application of the technology and of market competition to that. And I should add, in a society in which consumers care more about buying cheaper products than they care about buying products that are made with real concern for animals. So, one answer to your question would be, well, the problem is not capitalism. If all consumers were really concerned about animal welfare and would not buy animal products unless they were suitably convinced that the animal welfare standards were high, then we wouldn't have factory farming as it is today. And that would be still true under a capitalist economy, because producers are not going to make things for markets that disappear. And if the market for cheap meat produced with low animal welfare standards vanished, then capitalism would see to it that didn't exist anymore. So in that sense, capitalism exacerbates the problem as we have it with the consumers that we have now. And of course, capitalism, by its advertising and promotion, can actually help to ensure that consumers do stay the way they are.
And that's what I was getting at, right?
Yeah.
Isn't it sort of in the interest of, meat producers in the meat industry, have people that just sort of turn a blind eye, right? The meat arrives packaged, it looks nice. Let's forget about where it came from, because that is a potential problem, right? You don't want people to start thinking about that and pushing back against it. So there are these sort of forces, and I'm wondering whether they're sort of a natural part of, capitalism and the sort of need to sort of drive prices down and maximize profits and increase quantity. I mean, my business school professor tells me that those are they seem to be sort of part and parcel of the forces that one should expect, just given the incentives.
I think you will get those forces in a capitalist society, but you may get them in a non-capitalist society as well. Certainly, Soviet communism was no better in regard to animal welfare than capitalism, and maybe that was because the leaders wanted to remain popular with people, and providing cheap food was a way of being popular. And you could say the same about China today, although it would be hard to deny that China is really a capitalist economy. But in terms of trying to get government policies to improve animal welfare standards, that's really hard going, and it seems that that's hard going because the political leaders don't want to risk the unpopularity of higher prices for meat.
Yeah, I'm only smiling because I was reminded of this movie called Nothing's Illuminated, where an American Jew goes back to Eastern Europe to sort of look at their their heritage, and just sort of runs up against the locals who think that he or she, I don't remember the man or woman, that they're crazy.
Another book. I think it's called Everything is Illuminated.
Everything is Illuminated.
Nothing is Illuminated.
Yeah. That they're crazy, right? Like, you don't eat meat. That, it's just unthinkable, and that's certainly not a capitalist society. So that made me smile.
Right.
So, Peter, what if there were, let's say, two things that you'd like to see changing significantly in your lifetime, what would those be?
Well, I would really love to see factory farming abolished or eliminated, because it's such a vast quantity of suffering for tens of billions of animals. Something. If you include fish in aquaculture, which is like factory farming underwater, there's something like 200 billion animals raised and killed each year, and that's just such an enormous quantity of suffering. That I would love to see it ended. And of course, it would have many other benefits. It would greatly increase the supply of food available for the world, because all the grain we feed to these animals, or the fish meal in the case of carnivorous fish, would be available for humans to eat, or the fish meal, the fish wouldn't have to be caught out of the oceans. That would be a great benefit. There would be climate benefits as well, because the animal industry is a major producer of greenhouse gases. And there would be a great reduction in local pollution of both air and water. So I think there would be enormous benefits from that. Other than that, climate change is the other major issue that really worries me greatly. That is,
and that's a related problem, isn't it?
Well, it's related in that maybe about 1/5 of the greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere come from raising animals. So that's significant, but of course you would have to do something about our fossil fuel use as well. So I think that's a very important issue that we've been far too slow to act on, and we're already now starting to feel some of the consequences of that. And the third issue I should mention is people in extreme poverty. I think it's a scandal that we have something close to 1 billion people in extreme poverty in the world when we have such enormous affluence as well.
These are big problems, Peter. What's your proposal for how we should go about addressing them?
Well, there are many policy proposals. In my ethical work, I tend to focus on things that individuals can do, because I think that's empowering for individuals to see that they can have an impact. So, as I said, people can stop eating meat, or stop eating all animal products, or at least stop eating factory farmed products, and that will contribute to that. As far as climate change is concerned.
So on that, Peter, you talk about sort of effective altruism in your book in the last chapter. Say a little bit more about that. What does that mean?
Well, altruism is, as you would know, the idea of trying to make things better for others, make the world a better place. But the emphasis on effective altruism means that whatever you are doing to make the world a better place, whether it's donating money to effective non-profit organizations, or volunteering your time, you should try to do that in the way that gets the best value for the money or time you're putting in. So if you think about it in terms of donations to a non-profit organization, you should do some research and find out which non-profit will do the most good per dollar of donation that they receive. And that used to be quite difficult to find out. But now, especially in the area of helping people in extreme poverty, it's become a lot easier, because a lot of research that's been done, it's available online. I founded an organization called The Life You Can Save that actually recommends about 20 the most effective, independently assessed organizations that are helping people in extreme poverty. So, the research is now very easy to do. You can just go to the lifeyoucansave.org and look at the organizations we recommend. We've done it for you. But a lot of people just don't really think about that. They give much more impulsively, and therefore a lot of the value of their gift is wasted because they could have done more good by giving elsewhere.
You talk about the answers coming sort of at the from individuals and at the policy level. When I was reading that last chapter of your book, I was reminded of this book by Richard Thaler called Nudge.
Oh, yes.
Which is sort of an interesting way of thinking about how to nudge people's behavior in a direction that's better. How do you think about that? Is that sort of implicitly what you're suggesting?
I think a lot of the nudges that Richard Thaler, and I think it's Cass Sunstein writes it with him, I think a lot of the nudges that they talk about are switching defaults and things that people don't even really notice that they're being nudged, but they actually end up with more people doing what's good for them and good for others. Obviously, in the work that I do about animals or global poverty, it's a bit more overt than just nudging. It's really trying to get people to change their behavior. If there were a simple nudge that could do it, that would be good. And I suppose there are, and this gets back to the policy aspect of the question you asked, which I hadn't got around to addressing. There are actually nudges, and very recently there was a New York Times article about the policies of the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, with regard to providing more plant-based meals in hospitals. And what they simply did there is exactly a nudge. They switched the default. So if you go into a New York City hospital now, you will get a vegetarian or plant-based meal unless you specifically request a meat meal. And the Times reports that the great majority of people accept the plant-based meal. That has reduced the greenhouse gas emissions of these hospital meals by 36% or something like that, and reduces, I think it said it reduces costs as well. Anyway, it seems to be a win-win situation. So, if you have the power to do that, that's great. You can do it by a nudge, but I don't, obviously. I'm not in a position of power like that, so I have to try and persuade others, and if I can persuade policymakers as well as the general public, then that's better still.
What about educational institutions, schools and universities? I was looking at, whether ethics is part of the curriculum in high school education, and it looks like these decisions at the state level. But, I remember, as a kid in India, we had courses in civics. Mm-hmm. I'm not sufficiently familiar with sort of the U.S. high school education system, but isn't that something that should be part of a curriculum and something people talk about relatively early in life? And again, I'm reminded of, the 7-Up, give me a child till they're 7.
It's certainly good to talk about it early in life and to have it in schools, but I think constitutionally the federal government can't dictate across the country what the curriculum of school education is.
Maybe nudge it in that direction.
Yeah, maybe you can nudge it, certainly. But there is more ethics, and in fact, there's more philosophy going into high schools now. But it's not a compulsory subject. It's typically it's an option. But I do get students coming up to Princeton who've just out of high school, and some of them have got quite a sophisticated level of philosophy from what they did in high school.
So, Peter, last but not least, when I was just setting up here in your office, I noticed that you have an award called the Emperor Has No Clothes Award. I can't resist asking you what that's about.
Yes, and it's a little statuette of a slightly corpulent naked man with a crown on his head. So that was given...
You're being kind. Yes.
Right. That was given to me by the Foundation for Freedom from Religion. It's a body that is trying to keep the United States secular. And it was for the writing that I had done that was critical of, in particular, critical of religious teachings on issues that had affected others. So the influence of religion, I've had that for quite a few years. So the influence of religion on hostile attitudes toward gays and same-sex relations. This, at a time when there was certainly no same-sex marriage, and also on issues like abortion and physician-assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia, which also at that time were not legal, I think, anywhere in the United States. Or maybe they were illegal in a couple of states like Oregon and Washington in the Northwest, but not in anything like the extent today.
Great name for an award. So, Peter, no conversation these days would be complete without some discussion of AI. So let me ask you, what do you anticipate the impact of AI is going to be on animals?
Well, I think the impact of AI on animals will be bad, like the impact of most technologies on animals has been. In fact, we're already seeing that. You don't really have to anticipate it because AI is already being used in factory farms to regulate animals in various ways. And even though some of the people promoting that will say, well, we're using AI to try to reduce disease or to pick up early signs of disease in factory farmed animals or to give them the right quantities of food, and this is going to be good for them. But in fact, this is aiding factory farmers, and their interest will be in maximizing production. So if by picking up early signs of disease, that means that you can stock the animals more densely, which otherwise might be a thing that would produce more disease, then the animals will be stocked more densely. And even if they don't get the diseases, they're still going to be more stressed from the density of the stocking. It's like the use of antibiotics in factory farms. They control disease, but if factory farmers did not routinely dose all of their animals on antibiotics, then factory farming as we know it today would probably not exist because too many of the animals would die. So anything that facilitates factory farming and makes it cheaper and more efficient is going to be a bad thing for the animals. And that's part of the impact that we're already seeing. But there are other impacts, of course, and they will depend a bit on decisions that we made. So if you look at self-driving cars, they're being programmed to try to detect pedestrians and avoid hitting them. That's good. Are they also going to brake if animals cross in the road in front of the car and the car would hit the animal? Those are decisions that are still to be made, and given the attitudes we have to animals, it's not clear that they're always going to be made in the right way.
Could AI actually be used in a positive way in raising animals, such as through vision systems and things like that, just sort of sensing when they're in distress or sensing when they need something? Could it actually lead to better conditions?
Well, it would lead to better conditions if the producers wanted better conditions, but all the producers want is that the animals survive to get to market, and that's why those kinds of sensing systems, which are being used, I don't believe that they'll end up with better conditions for the animals. They'll just end up making it harder for plant-based products to compete with the factory farm products. No, unfortunately. The question always is not what the technology could do, but what the technology will do in the hands of the people who are using it and buying it and controlling it. And if those people are the giant corporations that are responsible for running most factory farms, then I don't think the outcome is going to be a good one for animals.
That's a slightly depressing thought, isn't it?
And that is a depressing thought. I agree. Now, I'm not saying that there are no areas where AI will be good for animals. I think AI can replace some animal tests, for example. It can screen at least new compounds to show that there's no point in testing these because it's highly predictable that they will be toxic to humans. So why test them on animals? And in fact, we might get AI that is more reliable than animal testing. So that could be benefit for both humans and animals. So I'm not saying that AI will never have benefits for animals, but it will only be in contexts where it actually works for humans as well.
So your reference to testing cosmetics on animals reminded me of the neuroscientist Tipu Aziz, who I think weighed in on animal testing. Was Tipu justifying animal use in areas such as cosmetics?
No, I don't associate Tipu Aziz with that comparison with cosmetics. Where he comes into my work, and I mentioned it in Animal Liberation Now, is he asked me about the ethics of his work on treating people with Parkinson's disease or symptoms of Parkinson's, an experiment which involved a number of monkeys, but he said it benefited hundreds of thousands of humans. So it was he was challenging me as a utilitarian to say, well, is this justified? And I don't really know enough about the facts of the experiment. I don't know whether there were other ways of doing this. I don't know how much the monkeys suffered. But taking it as a hypothetical example where there was no other way of helping the very large number of people with this condition, and there was a high expectation that you could do so by an experiment on a limited number of monkeys in which you did whatever you could compatible with the purpose of the experiment to reduce their suffering, I said that could be justified. So, it's an example of saying that, again, unlike some people from the more strictly animal rights side of the philosophical defense of animals, I'm not an absolutist in saying no animal experiment can be justified.
This reminds me of a conversation with Maneka Gandhi, who's an animal rights activist and actually a winner of the Peter Singer Award.
That's right.
Coincidentally. Yeah. And I asked her this question, like, where do you draw the line between, what it's okay to test on? And, so she sort of ducked the question, humorously, because I said, mice, cockroaches. And she sort of ducked the question, but you must get this question all the time, right? Where do you draw the line?
And she was a politician, so she's used to ducking questions, I guess, and I'm a philosopher, so I try not to duck questions.
Although she says she's not really a politician, she's just in politics.
Okay, but she's been a cabinet minister for a long time. No,
absolutely. Yeah. But how do you respond to that question?
You mean the line about which animals?
Where do you draw the line?
Well, that depends on whether animals can suffer, right? And I don't know about cockroaches, actually. Maybe they can suffer, maybe they can't. It's hard to know about insects because in some ways their behavior is more like pre-programmed, robotic, but not in all ways.
What about mice?
Oh, I'm sure mice can feel pain. Yeah. So, I don't think there's a fundamental difference between experimenting on a mouse or a beagle. The beagle is just more appealing to us. But yes, I'm sure mice can feel pain, and of course, far more mice and rats are used in experiments than dogs or cats. So,
and how do you sort of feel about that? Do you think that under some circumstances it's justified? It sort of depends on whether it's leading to some larger benefit.
Yes, it depends on what the expectation is, how good an expectation there is of a large benefit that could not be obtained in any other way. And as I said, that the suffering of the animal is minimized to the greatest extent possible.
Peter, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Before we wrap up, like I said, you've had a big impact on my thinking. Is there anything you'd like to say to the listeners?
Well, one thing that we haven't talked about is that, I've been talking about living ethically in terms of what we eat and in terms of what we donate to organizations helping people in extreme poverty, and also in relation to climate change. And some people will feel, this is kind of all rather burdensome. This is a demanding ethic. So I think we ought to talk about the fact that there's lots of good research in psychology now showing that when people have meaning and purpose in their lives, they actually enjoy their lives and find them more fulfilling than when they don't. And I think it is an inherent problem in the kind of society that we live in. This is another aspect of a capitalist society, that it encourages us to consume, but it's really meaningless consumption that doesn't provide lasting satisfaction. So it's like we're on a consumer treadmill where we aspire to something, we think it'll be wonderful if we can afford to buy it, we work hard to earn the money to buy it, we buy it, and once the novelty wears off, we're back to the same level of happiness that we were before, and then we repeat the cycle and still end up at the same level. Whereas when we give a real purpose to our lives and we think, oh, I'm contributing to helping people in poverty get a better life and escape poverty, or I'm contributing to getting animals out of the horrible conditions that they're in factory farms, and I'm working with other good people who are doing that as well, that sort of certainly helps. Then I think a lot of people feel their lives are going better, and they have more purpose, and they get up each day with something to do that they really want to do rather than that they just have to do.
And is this sort of, I guess, the flip side of this view that trying to maximize pleasure as an objective doesn't really lead to pleasure?
Yeah, I think that, yes, this is the ancient Greek paradox of hedonism, that if you directly aim at your own pleasure, it tends to evaporate. Doesn't really get you there. But if you pursue something that you think is worthwhile and you have energy in pursuing it and you use your skills and talents to pursue it as well as you can, then you find you get happiness along the way.
All right. Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Really an honor to have you on Brave New World.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming down here.
Thank you.